Once again, I'm back with another amazing story, friends. In this episode, I'll tell you the story of David, a human, and Nova, an alien woman. Ready? Let's begin. The alien woman said, "I'm not as beautiful as human women." I replied, "You're wrong. You're much more beautiful." The coffee aboard the Meridian was, by any objective measure, a war crime. David had told the ship's fabricator this on 19 separate occasions, and on the 20th morning of what he privately called the Great Bean Rebellion, he simply held the cup up to the nearest sensor cluster and said nothing at all, letting the silence carry his grievance like a diplomat delivering an ultimatum. The Meridian, whose intelligence answered to the name Wren, and who possessed roughly the emotional range of a very tired librarian, considered this for a moment before replying, "I have logged your disappointment. I have logged it 41 times now. I am building a shrine." David saluted the ceiling with the offending cup and drank anyway, because 8 months into a charting run through the unmapped fringe of the Corvin Reach, a man learned to accept certain betrayals as the price of adventure. They were a small crew for a survey ship which suited David fine. There was Henry, the engineer, a broad and perpetually grease-smudged man who spoke to the fusion coils more tenderly than he spoke to any living being, and who insisted, with the conviction of a prophet, that the ship's reconstituted lasagna was actually quite good if you stopped comparing it to lasagna. There was Ellie, the pilot, who could thread the Meridian through a debris field with the calm of someone parallel parking, and who had once beaten the ship's chess subroutine so badly that Wren had claimed a scheduled diagnostic and refused to play for a week. And there was Nova. David had spent a fair amount of his life around brilliant people. Brilliance, he'd found, tended to come wrapped in one of two packages: the loud kind that wanted you to know about it, and the quiet kind that assumed you already did and had moved on to more interesting problems. Nova was a third kind he hadn't known existed until the Meridian. She was a Sylthan researcher, all elegant stillness and long, tapering ears that swept back from her temples like something out of the old Earth stories about forests and firelight. And she was the single sharpest mind he had ever stood next to, and she seemed, genuinely, to have no idea. She would solve in her head a spectral drift problem that David needed a console and a strong cup of the aforementioned war crime to even begin, and then she would look up as if to ask whether she'd said something wrong. "You're doing the face again," she told him one shift without looking away from her readouts. "What face?" "The one where you've decided I'm impressive and you're annoyed about it." "That's not a face. That's my whole personality. I'm an impressed and annoyed man. It's in my file." The corner of her mouth moved, the small private thing that on Nova counted as a laugh, and David filed the moment away the way he'd been filing them for months now, quietly, without examining too closely why. His job was anomalies, the specialists they'd sent along to look at whatever the sensors couldn't explain, the strange gravitational whispers and light that bent the wrong way out here past the edge of anyone's map. Nova's was everything else that was interesting. Between them, they had spent 8 months cataloging a corner of the universe no one had ever seen, and somewhere in the middle of all that cataloging, David had come to treasure her company with an intensity that would have alarmed him if he'd stopped to add it up. He tried not to add it up. "Wren," Nova said, "how long until the next survey window?" 6 hours, the ship replied, assuming David does not attempt to negotiate with the coffee fabricator again. Each attempt sets the schedule back 4 minutes and lowers morale ship-wide. "My morale is fine," David said. "I was speaking of mine," said Wren. Henry's voice crackled in from the engine deck, cheerful and muffled, as though he were speaking with his head halfway inside a machine, which he almost certainly was. "Tell him the lasagna's back on the menu tonight. I fixed the flavor matrix." "The flavor matrix was not broken," Wren said. "The lasagna is functioning as designed. That is the tragedy." Nova glanced sideways at David, and there it was again. That flicker of amusement she wore so lightly, like she was surprised each time to find the universe capable of being funny. He grinned back and pretended, as he always did, that his attention had wandered elsewhere. Out the forward viewport the stars hung enormous and unbothered, thousands of them, none of them named by anyone he'd ever meet. The Meridian hummed on beneath his feet, A small, warm bubble of terrible coffee and worse lasagna and the best company he'd ever kept, drifting deeper into the dark. He didn't know yet that something out in that dark had already noticed them. He only knew, in the quiet way a person knows a thing before they'll admit it, that the woman beside him had become the reason the long voyage no longer felt long, and that this, sooner or later, was going to become a problem he could not solve with a console and a strong cup of coffee. The observation bay was David's favorite lie the ship told itself. Officially, it was a sensor annex, a room full of quiet instruments that watched the sky so the crew didn't have to. Unofficially, someone in the Meridian's design history had given it a broad, curving viewport and dimmed the lights low enough that a person could sit there and feel, briefly, like the whole vastness outside belonged to them alone. David found Nova there in the ship's arbitrary night, folded into the seat by the glass, the archive glow throwing soft blue light across her face. She hadn't heard him come in, or had chosen not to, and for a moment he simply watched her watch the screen. She was scrolling through Earth, not the maps or the star charts, the faces, old images from the ship's cultural archive, portraits and crowds and candid shots of people laughing at things centuries dead, the great churning human catalog of noses and cheekbones and smiles. David had seen the archive 100 times and never once thought about what it might look like to someone who wasn't in it. "You're up late," he said gently so as not to startle her. "I don't sleep the way you do," Nova said, which was true, and which he'd always found faintly unfair. "Sylthans rest in halves. One of me is always keeping watch." She said it without turning, her eyes still on the faces sliding past. He lowered himself into the seat beside her. On the screen, a woman from some sunlit Earth century laughed with her head thrown back, frozen mid-joy. "Research?" David asked. "Or just admiring the merchandise?" "Studying," Nova said. And then, after a silence that went on a beat too long to be nothing, "They're very beautiful. Human women. I didn't understand before this voyage how much your people build around it. The images, the songs, the whole archive leans toward it like a plant toward light." Her voice was even, careful, the voice she used for spectral drift and orbital math, and it was that very evenness that told David something underneath it had come loose. "Some of it," he allowed. "We built a lot of nonsense around a lot of things. We once fought a war over a chair." "A chair?" "A very good chair. Historians are divided." That earned him the corner of the mouth thing, but it faded too fast, and Nova kept looking at the glowing parade of strangers instead of at him. Then she said it, quietly, to the stars beyond the screen rather than to his face, the way a person sets down something they've been carrying so long they've forgotten it has weight. "I'm not as beautiful as human women." The words hung in the dim blue light of the bay, unguarded and painfully sincere, and David felt the whole easy machinery of banter he'd built over 8 months simply stop, because this was not a thing to be banter-ed. He had never once seen Nova doubt herself. He had watched her disagree with senior researchers over a comm channel without her pulse so much as rising, watched her be wrong exactly twice in 8 months, and admit it both times with the serene grace of someone correcting a typo. To hear this small fear come out of that same steady woman was like watching a mountain confess it was afraid of the rain. He didn't reach for flattery. Flattery would have been an insult, and she'd have heard it a light year off. He turned in his seat so that he was facing her fully, and he waited until the weight of his attention made her want to look, and he said without hesitation, without decoration, only the plain and total truth of it. "You're wrong. You're much more beautiful." Nova went still. It was a particular kind of stillness. Not the composed quiet she wore like a coat, but something underneath that, exposed. Slowly, for the first time since he'd sat down, her emerald eyes left the stars and came to his face. And he understood, with a small ache, that she was searching it. She was looking for the lie. She expected to find it, the way you expect to find a step at the bottom of a familiar staircase, some kindness stretched thin over pity. Some human politeness offered to the odd creature with the long ears who didn't belong in the archive of beautiful faces. She looked, and she looked, and David let her, and did not look away, because there was nothing there for her to find. Something in the bay had changed. He could feel it, the careful thing they'd built across all those months trembling suddenly at the edge of becoming something with a name, something neither of them had yet dared to say aloud. Nova's lips parted. The ship's hum wrapped around the silence. And David, whose heart was doing something complicated and unhelpful, had just enough time to think that he would remember this exact moment for the rest of his life, when the alarm went off. It was not a gentle alarm. Wren did not do gentle alarms. Red light drowned the soft blue of the bay, and the ship's voice came through stripped of every trace of its usual dry patience. "Contact," Wren said. "Long range. I have a contact in the dark ahead, and I do not understand what I am looking at." David was already on his feet. So was Nova, the moment shattering and reassembling into something professional, though her eyes flicked to his once, quickly, holding. "Talk to me, Wren," David said. "A derelict," the ship replied. "Drifting, no registry, and it is broadcasting a signal older than the day our two species first learned each other's names." By the time David reached the bridge, Ellie already had the derelict on the main display, and the sight of it did something unpleasant to the back of his neck. It hung in the dark like a thing that had been left to drown a very long time ago, a long, broken shape of a hull, its lines wrong in a way that took him a moment to place. Then he had it. The ship was old. Not old the way a decommissioned freighter was old, but old the way a fossil was old, from a design lineage that predated the standardized architectures everyone had used for 2 centuries. It was a first-contact-era vessel, from those raw and clumsy years when humans and Sylthans had first blundered into each other's space and decided after some tense misunderstandings and one genuinely regrettable incident involving a fruit basket not to shoot. "That's a museum piece," Henry said, arriving from the engine deck still wiping his hands on a rag. "That's older than the fruit basket. It predates the fruit basket by a decade," Wren confirmed, which David hadn't realized was a unit of measurement the ship recognized, and which told him the crew had told that story far too many times. Nova had gone straight to the science console, her earlier stillness folded away somewhere he couldn't reach, all of her poured now into the readouts. "The signal isn't a distress call," she said. "It's a marker beacon, a survey buoy signature, the old Sylthan pattern, the one we retired before I was born. Someone was charting this reach before any of us, and then they stopped." "Stopped charting or stopped existing?" David asked. "The data doesn't distinguish," Nova said, which is its own kind of answer. He came to stand at her shoulder, and together they read the corpse of the old ship the way physicians read a scan, and neither of them liked what it showed. The derelict wasn't merely dead, it was leaking. Whatever exotic core had once pushed it between the stars had cracked at some point in the long centuries of its drifting, and it had been quietly bleeding a gravitational instability into the surrounding space ever since. A slow, soft distortion, invisible, patient, curling the local space-time around itself like warm air rising off a road. On the console it showed as a faint spiral of contour lines, tightening inward. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," David said. "It's what you think it is," Nova said. "I hate when you do that. You asked me to tell you it wasn't. I don't lie to you." She said it lightly, but the words landed with an unexpected weight, both of them briefly and simultaneously remembering a dim blue room and a truth spoken into it, and David watched a faint color rise along the edge of one long ear before she looked pointedly back at her screen. "The distortion's shallow this far out, but it deepens toward the derelict. It's a well, a gravitational well, growing very slowly, and we drifted to the lip of it before Wren caught the gradient." "Ellie," David said, "let's back us off. Nice and gentle." Ellie's hands were already moving. The Meridian's engines pushed, and the ship, which had spent 8 months answering Ellie's touch like a trained animal, did not go where it was told. It slid. Not much. A lazy few degrees, A swimmer caught in a current too broad to feel until you tried to leave it. But it slid inward, toward the wreck, and Ellie's calm, parallel parking face did a thing David had never seen it do in 8 months, which was flicker. "That's not ideal," Ellie said, in the tone of someone reporting that the restaurant was out of the fish. "Ren," David said. "The instability has coupled to our drive field," the ship reported. "Every unit of thrust I apply to escape deepens the coupling. It is, and I want to be clear that I find this as tedious as you do, a trap that tightens when you struggle against it. The derelict is not pulling us in with force. It is pulling us in with patience." For a moment, nobody said anything. On the display, the old broken ship turned very slightly on its long axis, the way a fish hook turns, unhurried, certain of its work. "Okay," David said, and heard his own voice go into the register it went into when things stopped being interesting and started being a problem. "Okay, so we can't out-muscle it, because muscle is exactly what it eats. That means we outthink it." He looked at Nova, and Nova was already looking at him, and something passed between them that was 8 months in the making, not the trembling new thing from the observation bay, but its older, sturdier sibling, the thing that had made them good together long before either had thought about anything else. Trust. The plain working trust of two people who had solved 100 smaller problems side by side and had, without ever discussing it, come to assume they'd solve the next one too. "The buoy," Nova said slowly. "It's still broadcasting, which means the derelict still has power in its core, which means the well isn't a scar. It's a wound that's still open." "And an open wound," David said, following her, the shape of it rising in his mind. "Can be closed." "Can be closed," Nova agreed. "The question is from where?" The console chimed then, soft and awful, and the spiral of contour lines drew one increment tighter, and Ren said, into the quiet, "I should mention that the patience I described is not infinite for us. At current drift, we reach the derelict's hull in 9 hours. I would very much prefer to have a plan by hour 8. They had a plan by hour 6, which was 3 hours better than Ren had asked for, and, David felt, deserved some kind of certificate. The trouble was that the plan was terrible. "Let me say it out loud," Henry said, "so we can all hear how stupid it is. Somebody has to go over there, onto the museum piece, the one that's actively eating our ship, and crawl down into the broken core it's leaking from, and shut it off by hand, because the coupling means we can't do it from range without the well tightening on the signal." He set down his rag with the finality of a man laying flowers at a grave. "That's the plan." "That's the plan," David agreed. "I want it noted that I hate it." "It's noted," said Ren. "It is, in fact, the 42nd thing I have noted today. I'm considering a second shrine." The mechanics of it were unkind. The derelict's core had failed in a way that had let its containment slip, and containment, Nova explained, could not simply be switched off. It had to be talked down, walked backward through the exact sequence its long-dead builders had used to bring it online, or it would let go all at once and take a good portion of local space-time with it, the meridian included. That required 2 things the ship could not do from a distance. It required David's hands and instincts on the anomaly itself, reading the well the way only an anomalies specialist could read it, feeling where it wanted to go. And it required Nova's mind on the sequence, because the shutdown pattern was written in the old Sylthan survey architecture, a language of engineering her people had retired, but that lived, apparently, somewhere in the deep, quiet halves of her, which meant they were both going, together, into the place neither of them might come back from. Ellie flew them across in the Meridian's little maintenance skiff, threading the growing distortion with her jaw set, and set them against the derelict's ancient airlock with a touch so soft it was almost tender. "I'll hold station as long as the well lets me," she said. "The second it stops letting me, I'm gone. And I'm not asking permission. Those are the rules. You made me say them, David, so don't you dare make me break them." "Wouldn't dream of it," David said, and meant it, and hated it. Inside, the old ship was a tomb of frozen air and dead light, and their suit lamps swung through corridors that hadn't known a footstep in longer than either species had kept records. It was, David thought, exactly as bad as advertised, right up until the moment it got worse, which was when they reached the core chamber and the failing lights of the derelict flickered on around them of their own accord, roused by their presence into a dim red half-life, and Wren's voice came thin and stretched across the widening distance. "I am losing you," the ship said. "The coupling is degrading comms. You have perhaps 40 minutes before I cannot reach you at all, and Ellie has perhaps 50 before the skiff cannot fight the current. I would ordinarily fill this silence with something dry. I find I don't want to. Good luck, both of you." Then there was only the two of them, and the wounded old heart of the ship, and the clock. They worked. God, they worked well. His hands, her mind, the sequence unspooling between them in a rhythm 8 months in the making, and for a while there was no room in David for anything but the task. But the well fought back the way Wren had promised, tightening each time they gained ground, and somewhere around the point where the air in David's suit began to taste like a decision he'd have to make soon, Nova stopped, mid-sequence, and said his name. Just his name. It stopped him cold. "If this doesn't work," she said, and her voice in his helmet was very steady and very careful, the voice from the observation bay. "There are things I've spent 8 months not saying because there was always going to be a better time. I've just realized there isn't going to be a better time. There's only this one, which is, I want to point out, an absolutely terrible one. It's the worst one," David agreed, his own voice not quite working. "It's genuinely the worst possible time and place. Freezing, poorly lit, a collapsing gravitational anomaly, 0 out of 10. Please continue." The corner of the mouth thing, even now, even here, and it undid him completely. "In the bay," she said, "when you told me I was wrong. I looked for the lie. I know. I let you look. I didn't find it." Her emerald eyes found his through 2 layers of visor and the red gloom. "I've spent my whole life certain I was standing just outside the warm part of the room, and you looked at me like I was the fire. Nobody has ever, David. I don't know how to be looked at like that." "You learn," David said thickly. "I'll teach you. I've got a whole curriculum. It's mostly just me looking at you like an idiot for the rest of my life, but I've workshopped it and I think it holds up." She laughed. Actually laughed. The whole thing. Not the corner, but all of it. Bright and startled in that dead red chamber. And it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, and the clock was still running, and the well drew 1 increment tighter around them both. The laugh cost them 4 seconds, and David decided those were the best spent 4 seconds of his life and got back to work. Because a confession, however overdue, does not shut down a collapsing core, and the well had used their moment of tenderness to draw its coils another degree tighter, patient and awful, the way it did everything. "Talk me through the last phase," he said, and Nova's mind snapped back to it with a precision that would have frightened him if it hadn't been so magnificent. "The old Sylthan sequence had a final movement," she explained, "the most dangerous part, the point where you didn't fight the well at all, where you gave it exactly what it wanted for one held breath, let the containment go slack in the specific direction it was straining toward, and used its own hunger to carry it backward through its startup pattern and down into sleep. It was," she said, "less like defusing a bomb, and more like convincing a landslide to walk back uphill by agreeing with it. So we let it win," David said, "so that it loses." "We let it think it's winning," Nova corrected. "There's a difference, and the difference is everything, and I need your hands to feel it, because if we release the containment a half-second too early, it doesn't sleep. It lets go, and neither of us will have time to be embarrassed about how badly it went." "Small mercies," David said, and put his hands where she told him, and closed his eyes, and felt for the well. He'd spent his whole career learning to read anomalies, and he had never in his life read one this closely, this intimately, the great slow hunger of it pressing against his palms through the derelict's failing controls. He could feel where it wanted to go, inward, always inward, greedy and simple as gravity itself. Nova's voice counted him down through the sequence, low and even in his helmet. each step of an engineering her people had abandoned before she was born, rising out of the quiet halves of her exactly when it was needed. And at the final beat, when every instinct he owned screamed to hold on, to fight, to pull away from the collapse, he let go instead. He gave the landslide the downhill it craved. For one endless, sickening instant, nothing happened, and David was certain he'd killed them both. Then the well shuddered, and, impossibly, obediently, it began to walk backward uphill. The tightening spiral loosened, the terrible patient pull slackened. The ancient core, coaxed and flattered and outmaneuvered by a woman speaking its own dead language, sank grudgingly toward sleep. On David's readout, the contour lines that had been strangling them started one by one to unwind. "It's working," he breathed. "Nova, it's working." Which was, of course, precisely when the derelict began to come apart. The old ship had held itself together for centuries out of little more than habit, and the well's own gravity holding its pieces close. And now that the well was releasing them, the wreck remembered all at once that it was supposed to be dead. A shudder ran the length of the hull. Somewhere behind them, a bulkhead that had waited 200 years for an excuse finally found one, and the corridor they'd come in through folded with a groan David felt in his teeth. "Ellie," he said, "if you're getting any of this—" "Getting it," came her voice, thin and fierce, and there, thank God, still there. "Skiff's back at the lock. The current's turning as your well dies. I've got a window and it is closing, so move, move, move." They moved. Through the buckling red dark, the derelict dying around them as fast as it had killed slowly, and they'd nearly made the lock when the deck heaved and David heard Nova's boot catch, heard her go down, heard the small sharp sound of her breath as a falling strut pinned her leg against the deck. He was back at her side before he'd decided to be. "Go," she said, already trying to work herself free, already doing the arithmetic. "David, the window." "Yeah, I heard her. I was there." He got his shoulder under the strut. It did not move. Funny thing about the curriculum I mentioned. Chapter 1 is I don't leave. It's a short chapter, very repetitive. This is not the time to be. It's exactly the time. It's the whole time. He heaved again, everything he had, the derelict screaming around them, and felt the strut shift a merciful inch. Enough. Just enough, for Nova to drag her leg free with a gasp. Then, his arm was around her and hers around him, and they were through the lock and falling into the skiff in a tangle as Ellie sealed it and threw them clear. And behind them, the ancient survey ship gave up its long, 2-century pretense of existing and came apart entirely, quietly, its pieces drifting free into a dark that no longer curved around anything at all. No shockwave, no fire. Just a wound in space finally, gently closing, and an old ship at last allowed to be as dead as it had always deserved to be. In the cramped skiff, breathing hard, Nova's hand found his and held it, and did not let go. The lasagna that night was somehow the best thing David had ever eaten, and he understood at last that Henry had been right about it the entire time, not because the flavor matrix had improved, but because he had. It turned out that a man who has recently declined to leave a collapsing derelict tends to find the ordinary business of being alive vastly more delicious than he did the day before. He said as much at the little table in the galley, and Henry pointed a fork at him with the wounded triumph of a prophet finally vindicated. 2 years I've been telling you people. 2 years. It took a near-death experience, and I'll take it. I still think it's a war crime, Ellie said, but a beloved one now. Like the coffee. The coffee remains inexcusable, said Wren, whose sensors had returned to full function along with the rest of the ship the moment the well died and released its grip on their drive field. The Meridian was whole again, hull sound, comms clear, engines answering Ellie's hand like the trained animal it had always been. The trap had let them go completely. There was nothing left out there in the dark now but the scattered, harmless pieces of an old ship, and a stretch of space that curved the way space was supposed to, and no more. They logged it all properly, because that was the job. The derelict had been a Sylthan survey vessel from the first raw years of contact, sent out to chart the Corvin Reach before anyone had maps or reasons to trust, and its core had failed, and it had drifted and waited, patient and dying, for 2 centuries. Nova filed the record herself, and when she reached the field for the ship's crew, the people who had gone out first into a dark no one had named and never come home, she sat with it a long moment before she wrote. David watched her do it, and understood that she was writing them a kindness across 200 years. The acknowledgement that they had been here, that they had mattered, that someone had finally come and found them and switched off the terrible machine so they could rest. The old buoy fell silent when the core slept. Its work, at last, was done. So was theirs. Later, the ship's arbitrary night, the crew asleep or pretending to be David found Nova in the observation bay. She was in the same seat by the same broad curve of glass, and for a moment the symmetry stopped him in the doorway, because the last time he'd found her here, she'd been studying the archive of beautiful human faces and setting down a fear she'd carried her whole life. Now the archive was dark. She wasn't looking at the faces. She was looking at the stars, thousands of them, and she wasn't looking at them like a woman standing outside the warm part of the room. She turned when he came in, and she was looking at him. "You're up late," he said gently, the way he had before. "I rest in halves," she said, the way she had before, and the corner of her mouth moved, and then the whole thing followed, the full laugh, the one he'd first heard in a dying red chamber and had privately resolved to spend the rest of his life earning again. He sat down beside her in the same seat, and the 8 months and the derelict and the well all seemed to gather quietly into this one small lit room. "I've been thinking about the bay," she said. "The first time. What you said. I remember it well. I've workshopped it since. I stand by it. I looked for the lie," she said, "and I didn't find it. And I decided you were simply kind, or simply strange, and I filed it away as a thing I couldn't quite believe." She turned the emerald weight of her gaze fully on him. "And then, in that horrible frozen chamber, you put your shoulder under a 200-year-old strut rather than leave me, and I understood that you'd meant it. Not the flattery kind of meaning it, the kind where it's just true, and you've stopped arguing with it." Her long ears caught the dim starlight. "I believe you now, David. That's what's changed. Not that I've decided I'm beautiful, that I've stopped needing to stand outside the room to check." And David, who had come aboard the Meridian 8 months ago as a man who filed his feelings away in the same careful drawer where he kept his impressed and annoyed face, who had spent a lifetime being clever precisely so he'd never have to be plain, found that the cleverness had all quietly drained out of him and left only the plain thing underneath, which was better anyway. "You were wrong in the bay," he said. "You said you weren't as beautiful as human women. You were wrong, and I told you so, and I'll tell you every day if it helps it hold. You're not less than any of them." He reached over and took her hand, the one that had found his in the skiff and not let go. "You're much more beautiful. You always were. I just got to be the idiot lucky enough to say it first." Outside the glass, the unnamed stars burned on, patient and enormous, and no longer frightening at all. And in the quiet hum of the small warm ship, 2 people who had spent 8 careful months not saying a thing finally stopped not saying it. And the long voyage, which had once felt so very long, felt at last exactly the right length to have carried them here. They crossed a galaxy of unmapped dark, and the hardest distance David ever closed wasn't the one between 2 ships. It was the few feet between a woman convinced she stood outside the warm part of the room, and the simple, stubborn truth that she had been the fire all along. We build such careful archives of what beauty is supposed to look like. We study the faces, we learn the songs, we lean toward them like plants toward light, and somewhere in all that studying, how many of us quietly decide we don't belong in the picture? How many hours have you spent looking for the lie in someone's kindness, so certain it was there that you never noticed it wasn't? Maybe the people who love us aren't being generous. Maybe they're just standing where they can see clearly. And maybe the bravest thing any of us ever does is stop arguing with them, to finally set down the fear we've carried so long we forgot it had weight, and let ourselves be looked at like the fire. So here is the question the stars leave behind. Who has been telling you the truth about yourself all along? And how much of your life have you spent refusing to believe them? The end. Friends, we've reached the end of Nova and David's story. Before we go, I have a request. Please hit the like button, leave your thoughts on the story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. Until we meet again in another sci-fi traveler story, goodbye.